Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Sarah Eggleston, the Science Officer at Pages, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker of this meeting, Rashid Cheddadi. Rashid is Research Director at CNRS at the University of Montpellier in France. His research topics include paleoecology, paleobiogeography, and quantitative past climate reconstructions from fossil pollen records. He has studied the role of glacial refugia and post-glacial recolonization processes in the distribution of modern plant species and how these past changes may help to manage future threats to plant species. His long-standing collaborations with vegetation modelers and geneticists have led him into the field of protecting endangered mountain tree species in Morocco and Lebanon and prioritizing effective protected areas in the face of ongoing climate change. Today, he will be talking about fossil data collected in Morocco over the past 30 years with a plenary entitled Glacial Refugia and Future Microrefugia, an effective plan to save plant species. Thank you very much, Rashid.
Thank you, Sarah, for this introduction. Let me start sharing my screen first. Can you see it, Sarah? Is it okay?
Yes, it looks great, Rashid.
Okay, thank you so much. It is a real and great pleasure for me today to give this plenary talk. And as Sarah said, I work on other areas in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, but this talk will be dedicated to all the paleoecological work that has been done in Morocco, and mostly how this work was used through time with not only scholars from different universities in Morocco, but also with stakeholders in Morocco, like foresters and so on, to try to make our paleo research useful for managing species. So the title of my talk today is Glacial Refugia and Future Microrefugia as an effective plan to save plant species. As we all know, the migration rate of species and the ongoing climate change will not be equal for all the organisms. And in this plot that I have extracted from the IPCC report 2014, you can see on the right-hand side, the average climate velocity, and on the left-hand side, the maximum speed at which species can move in kilometers per decade. So it is clear that plants, the migration rate of plants to cope with the velocity of the climate change is very weak. And in such case, whatever the climate scenario we use, here the blue one, I don't know if you can see it well, it's the Paris Agreement, which is the RCP 2.6. This smoothest climate scenario is already harsh or too fast for plant species and mostly tree species that you can see here. Not talking about the other climate scenarios between the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, where plant species will be threatened to extinction. So this first option of species to migrate by themselves with their seeds and colonize new suitable areas seems to be not totally or not exactly realistic for all species, and mostly mountain tree species. There is another option, which broadly speaking integrates model simulations to predict or to design suitable habitats for the species, for the survival of species. And using those predictions, one can think of translocating seedlings or seeds to make populations of this threatened species persist. But this option has also many I would say, side effects in terms of competition with species that are already in the predicted suitable habitat, and species that can become invasive, and so on and so forth. So this option can be realistic in some cases, but not for all species. There is a third option, which consists of trying to keep few populations of the species in the areas where they are today. We have to keep in mind that this option requires the conservation, or the keeping several populations in several areas isolated, so that they can exchange some genes and therefore not decline genetically. So this option has also its flaws, but this is the option that I will discuss today. This option of looking for a future microrefugia for species stems from something that we have been studying for several decades now. What we see from the fossil, mostly the pollen records, is that during the last glacial period, most of the temperate zones in the northern hemisphere, and this is valid for Europe, North America, even in Asia, trees were not capable of living under the last glacial climate. So there was a retreat, or dislocation of the range of these species into these small and scattered, fragmented areas where they persisted during the last glacial period. These glacial refugia had a climate that was more favorable for trees than the global climate. So these refugia were identified by fossil records over the past 40 or 50 years. During the Holocene, what we see is that from these refugia, animals like bears and hedgehogs, but also plants, like here, this is the case of the oak and pine, started to migrate from these refugia to colonize Europe. And this is I would say, a pattern that is observed for animals and plants and all kind of species for which the temperate zone that we see today in Europe was not suitable. So the impact of these glacial refugia can be retrieved in their genome. And for instance, in this study on oak, we can see these colors which show us the different haplotypes which indicate which are the imprints of the isolation in the long-term isolation of species in these refugia around the Mediterranean. So these glacial refugia helped us to preserve, or help the species to be preserved through a long period of hostile climate. And then what we see today in Europe in terms of forests and at flat landscapes or in the mountains come from these refugia. So based on this idea of that glacial refugia allowed species to be saved from extinction during the last glacial times, scientists started to think, why not using them? Why not using this refugia concept to preserve threatened species, the species that are threatened today, and to preserve them in the future? Let's have a look at the literature over the past decades. The word glacial refugia starts to appear in the publications about 40 years ago. So we have a record of 40 decades of an increasing interest in this concept. Over the past 20 years, we started to be more interested in these refugia, in this concept, as an option for plant conservation. But the accuracy of our knowledge refugia is becoming more and more accurate only during the past 10 years, where we started to look at refugia at the micro scale with microclimate, and we define them with more accurate tools and with more accurate manner. And there we started to see more and more publications using the microrefugia concept as a future option for conserving or preserving plant species from extinction. This concept was initially, or among the first publications designed or published by Valentine Rule in 2009 in about vegetation in Latin America. But after this publication, there were so many, and we started to look at these microrefugia from a climate point of view, from a topographic or landscape point of view, and we also investigated the evolution of species inside these microrefugia, and we ended up with the I would say a more or clearer idea of how we may use these microrefugia to preserve to preserve species from the ongoing climate warming. Now, if we look at where is the problem, and the problem happens in these areas which are hotspots of biodiversity. This plot shows in red the hotspots of biodiversity in the world. Sorry, I did not put the reference, but this is Myers in 2001 who published this initial paper. So what we can see from this map is that the hotspots of biodiversity, where we have the highest endemism and the highest diversity, there is also the highest threat to these species. And what is even more interesting is that these hotspots occur in areas which are not the richest areas in the world. When I say rich, it's in terms of resources to manage this biodiversity issue. And today, as I said, I will talk about Morocco. In Morocco, there are about 900 endemic plant species, which I mean 900 species that occur only in Morocco. And so this is more than the fifth of the total species diversity in Morocco, which has about 4,200 species. So preserving this tremendous amount of endemic species, which many of them are threatened today, can be a daunting task. I have to stress that Morocco is really doing a great job in this context, and there are many national parks and several biosphere reserves, and I have been talking with the foresters, and they are planning new biosphere reserves to protect and to try to save species and some forests from extinction. So there is an ongoing great effort to save plants, but again, saving all of them might be a daunting task. And today I will try to show you what we are trying to do to help forest managers to make their work more optimized in some way. To illustrate this approach, I will show you some data on the Atlas cedar. I have been working on these species for a couple of years now. And the Atlas cedar, or Cedrus atlantica in Latin, is an endangered species according to the red list of the IUCN, and the population trend is decreasing. And I will show you some slides where you can see that just over the past few decades, the decline is very strong. So it is a tree that can live for several centuries. The last the oldest cedar tree died in 2016 in the Middle Atlas, and it was about nine centuries. The age was about 9 centuries. The Atlas cedar is present in the mountains in Morocco, in the Rif Mountains and the Atlas Mountains, and also in Algeria. The Atlas cedar can stand snowy winters, and it requires, in fact, cold winters for for the germination of its seeds. And it is also a species that can stand harsh climates, and sometimes quite harsh. These are the precipitations, and you can see it can stand almost an arid climate with less than 500 millimeters per year. And this picture, I took this picture in the high Atlas, which are the last populations, the lowest populations in terms of latitude in Morocco, that are almost close to the desert. And you can see that the ground is bare and there are no, the biomass is very low. So this tree is kind of robust tree and resilient and can stand harsh climate. However, the problem is that harsh climate, when it's how to say, over a short time span, then the Atlas cedar can be resilient and re-spread and regenerate. But if the drought is installed in the forest over a long period of time, then the damage can be strong. These pictures, I took these pictures in 2009 in the eastern most parts of the distribution in the Rif Mountains, and at that time the trees were drying. This is not an insect attack, but all the forest was just like this, and there were no insects. Recently, just before the COVID, I went there, and this forest was a ghost forest. So the impact of the drought is very, very, very strong, and populations are really declining in few years. Sorry, I had to. Okay. These were observations. Now we went to the lab, and we took some we took some course on the field, and we did some modeling to try to understand why do we have this trend, and is it recent, and how does it go? So we took some corings, and we also collected some data from the literature and so on. So this is the modern range today, and you can see that these are very tiny spots in the Rif Mountains. This is the northern part of Morocco that you can see here. From the data that we have collected on the field and with other colleagues and friends in Morocco, and from the literature, we tried to reconstruct the past distribution of the Atlas cedar during the Holocene. And this is, how to say, a tentative reconstruction where we show that, in fact, the Atlas cedar had a much more extended distribution or range than today. So we use this information, and we calibrated a dynamic vegetation model to simulate this how to say, the decreasing trend of the Atlas cedar over the past 5 decades. So these are the transient model simulations that we did between 1960 and 2010. And what you can see, there are also, of course, there are several other simulations between these two time slices, but I will show only these two extreme ones. What we can see in these two simulations is the striking regression of the range that is here in green. This is in 50 years. So if we look at the data more precisely, we can see that we moved from 40,000 hectares in 1960 to 10,000 in 2010. This is 75% decrease. 75% of the total range was blown up in in 5 decades. Not only the range decreased, but also the tree line that moved up by more than 200 meters. In 1960, we found, or the Atlas cedar was, the tree line was situated at about 1,400 meters above sea level. Now, today, and this is something that you can check if you go to the field, you will not find any cedar trees below 1,600 in the Rift Mountains. So this is a major retreat of this beautiful endemic species in Morocco. When we saw that the impact of climate on the Rift Mountain, and we wanted to contribute to its conservation, then we wanted to make, how to say, a more thorough or more synthetic view of what's going on and try to set up a conservation plan to save it. So this is basically more or less the pollen records that have been studied in Morocco. I know that there are some others, but apologies for my colleagues who that I haven't mentioned here, but more or less what we can see from all these records that cover between 25,000 years and late Holocene, what we see is that, for instance, in the Rift, this decline started about 2,000 years ago, and now it is more and more pronounced. In the High Atlas, which is located in the south of the range, Atlas cedar was present there. We can see some occurrences here, but today there are none. The picture that I have showed you of the Atlas cedar almost on sand is located in this green spot. So this is the area where we have cedars, but below there are none today. So there is also a major regression of the Atlas cedar in the High Atlas. In the Middle Atlas, I would say that so far so good. We had a nice populations, and there are still today some nice populations that are located in national parks, but we can observe also a decline, mostly in this site here that was studied by Henry Lamb, where say 20 years ago the lake was surrounded by Atlas cedars, and today there are none. But we have observed this in many sites. So we used this data to try to reconstruct how the Atlas cedar reacted to the climate change over the past 20,000 years. So this is the time span between 20,000 and the beginning of the Holocene, more or less. This is the early Holocene, and this is the late Holocene. So what we can see from this reconstruction, and that is based on these fossil records, is that when climate was cold, the Atlas cedar colonized cold areas at lower latitudes, from almost the sea level to about 1,400 meters. And as soon as the climate started to warm up and moisture is available, Atlas cedar started to migrate from these warmer areas that are at lower altitudes to higher altitudes, because as I told you before, Atlas cedar requires cold winters. So it is at the same time looking for cold winters and more moisture at higher mountains. Today, what we see here is about the situation of today. Today, there are no Atlas cedars below 1,400 meters, and its range extends up to 2,200 meters. So there is a double problem for the Atlas cedar to persist. The first problem is the migration rate, and with the abrupt or the fast climate change, I don't think that it can migrate by itself to new areas or to upper elevations in less than 50 years. And the other problem is that, for instance, in the Rift Mountains, the highest elevations are about 2,400 millimeters, and the species is already at 200 and at 2,200 meters above sea level. So it is almost at the very top of the mountains in the reef. So what I have showed you in terms of refugia seem to be really the last chance or the last option for the species to persist in this area. So based on these fossil data, we wanted to go a little bit further and make a plan for its conservation. And the plan is we wanted to optimize the chances of this species to persist in Morocco based on two things. The first one is to look for suitable habitats. I was talking about microrefugia, and then evaluate the capacity of the populations that are in these microrefugia to persist locally over the long term. And this requires some information about their genetics. Once we have identified more or less these microrefugia and the genetics of the species, that the idea is to make a hierarchy of these suitable areas and suitable populations so that managers can optimize their managing plans. In other words, to give a stronger priority to those populations which have the highest chance to persist. So in the first place, we spent a couple of weeks collecting leaves of Atlas cedar, and this is my colleague and dear friend Pierre Taberlet from the University of Grenoble. We collected leaves from the Atlas cedar and to genotype all these populations that you can see here in blue, from the Atlas, the high Atlas up to the Rif Mountains. We sampled more than 30 populations. So this is the first idea, is to genotype the species, to try to find out where are the populations that have the highest genetic diversity, and therefore to have the highest chances to persist locally. Just one word about the genetics for those of you who can be interested, and we can talk about that on the chat. Pierre and his team used the skimming as a method to collect information from nuclear, mitochondrial, and chloroplastic DNA. And the genetic marker that we have used for the genetic diversity is the allelic richness, and that's the only variable that I will show today, not to go into those kind of details. So beside the genetics, we wanted to have some idea on the location of microrefugia, and some colleagues have published some nice papers about the landscape topography as I would say a variable that can help us find out where these microrefugia can be. So we use the terrain ruggedness to evaluate the occurrence of these refugia. Terrain ruggedness or landscape rugosity is in fact just the difference between one grid cell, the difference in elevation between one grid cell and the 9 surrounding cells. So roughly what we see on this map is a scale here from red to green. The more red and the more abrupt or the most rugged is the terrain. Flat areas are in green and rugged areas are in red. On top of this map, you can see the location of all the populations that we have collected for a DNA. And the blue area here is the Atlas cedar distribution. So if we superpose the genetic diversity based on the allelic richness, and the scale is here on the bottom right, we can see roughly that those populations which have the highest genetic diversity, which is in dark blue, are located also in rugged areas. You can see here. And those populations who have the lowest genetic diversity are located in flatter or less rugged areas. So based on the landscape rugosity and the genetic diversity, we tried with many colleagues to build up a conservation index. It is a quite simple index, but it integrates these parameters and it provides us with a hierarchy. This conservation index is based on the genetic diversity of each population, the terrain, the rugosity of the area where the population is, and it is weighted by a distance between the climate, the modern climate envelope of the population and a future scenario. We have published this work last month in March 2022, if you are interested in conservation, in conservation science and practice. So we used these data to build this conservation index. And this conservation index helped us to set up a priority for conservation of the species. Red is high priority, orange is medium to high, and so on and so forth, until green, which is low priority. Please don't get me wrong. This is not an index that says, okay, let's forget about those populations which have which are green. No, this is not the goal at all. This is just in case of we need to manage the resources and optimize the conservation plans, then we can use this scale to choose or to put more efforts on conserving those populations which are in red here. So the populations that deserve or that should be preserved priority are those in the Rift Mountains, which are in red and orange. And indeed, these populations have the highest genetic diversity, and therefore they can adapt to well, they are supposedly capable of a certain adaptation or more than the other populations, and they are located in highly rugged areas. But as I said earlier, the problem in the Rift Mountains is that these populations are almost at the top. So there is an very urgent need to preserve these microrefugia with these small populations. But there are also other populations in the northeast of the Middle Atlas here, or in the Middle Atlas here. So the idea is just to provide the managers with a tool, and we have published this work with foresters, and they agree, and they are really how to say they like the idea and they want to integrate it into their work. So we are really happy to set up this tool for trying to preserve the species from extinction. I think I am done with my talk. Well, yes, this is the last thing I would like to say. Okay, this option for saving species could be okay, but many colleagues, as any option, may have some critiques or questions and so on. So yes, microrefugia may not be for everyone or every species, but this is just, again, let's take it as an additional option in some cases, in some areas, for some countries, some resources, and so on. It is not the option for saving all plant species. Before I end up my talk, I would like to say that this is the only work, this is not the only work going on in Morocco in terms of paleoecology and paleoclimate and quaternary studies, but there are many other works and many other groups and colleagues, and I would like just to cite a few of them, like Ilham, who has organized or how to say coordinated the organization of this meeting on an endemic species in the southern part of Morocco. This is the argan tree, but there are also groups in Agadir working on speleothems, Marrakesh, hydrology, and also in Beni Mellal, whom the president of the university gave us some welcome words. So yes, there are many areas where science, paleoscience can be done in Morocco, and you are all welcome to join these groups for any other topic. Like Morocco is also at the gate of the Sahara, and there is also a big issue about the Green Sahara and so on. So please get in touch with these Moroccan groups. They really deserve, and they are worth collaboration. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any question, I'm ready to answer. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rashid, for this very interesting talk. We have gone a little bit over time, so I would suggest that we take the question from Ilham that's in the chat, and then we should head off to a break before the first e-poster talks. So Ilham asks, how do you estimate this retreat in the future? Do you have any idea about the evolution of the cedar in the next, for example, 50 years under the current global changes?
I don't think that we can talk of a linear retreat or exponential. It really. I would like to talk about the concept of metapopulations, and when we look at some populations, it depends on their size and their composition and so on. And sometimes we see, and this is something we saw in Morocco, a population in a very good health, which disappeared in less than 15 years. And voices were wondering why. So we cannot really predict in a linear way how the process will be. And also climate does not change linearly in the Mediterranean. We can have severe drought in 2 or 3 years in a row, and then nothing for 5 years. If we have that, then if we have that kind of alternation, then this kind of trees or species can be resilient and resprout and regenerate. If not, it will disappear. So there are many variables in the forest dynamics that I can't really tell if it will be linear or exponential, but it's fast. It's really fast now.
Great, thanks so much. We do have a couple more questions that just came in. Graciela would like to know how managers may help the very threatened riff populations if they're at the edge of the altitudinal range. What would be a strategy to preserve those microrefugia?
Well, there is a site on the very northwest of the rift. It's in Jebel Kelti, which is very steep, and really to reach the populations there, you have to climb the mountain. And these populations are very well saved. What I mean is that when you how to say not let humans going into the forest, then that is 90% of the threat that is removed. So what managers can do is to make these microrefugia, these small populations, as heavens, as areas that cannot be reached by tourists, locals, no one. These populations has to be totally preserved from any impact. That would give them a chance to persist for a longer time period. Thank you, Rasila, for this question, by the way.
Great, thanks. And one last question from Mike, who asks, what are other key components of the Atlas cedar ecosystem? Are they also under threat? And if so, could they also be conserved along with the efforts to conserve the cedar?
Yes, well, the Atlas cedar is almost a monospecific ecosystem. There are a few oxycedar and oak, and there are some oak species like Petreia and which have been also losing parts of their range in Morocco. So the threat is not on the Atlas cedar, but on other species. in the forest, if you go to in spring, in this time now, today in May, you can see in under the forest there are beautiful flowers, peonia, which is a tiny shrub, which is also a threatened species to extinction. So if cedar disappears, then many species of that ecosystem will disappear as well.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you. This was a wonderful opening to the plenary talks. We will now break until the hour when we will have the first